My name is Ethan Marshall, and for most of my career, I thought I understood loyalty, what it meant to give it, and what it meant to expect it in return. At 36, I was the head of product innovation at Linvera Systems, a mid-sized but rapidly growing software solutions company headquartered in Chicago. My department specialized in developing predictive analytics tools for large-scale logistics networks, a field that wasn't just profitable but transformative. I had joined Linvera 5 years ago, leaving behind a comfortable position at a larger firm because I craved the creative freedom that smaller organizations promised. And for a while, it felt like the best decision I'd ever made. I poured myself into the work. Early mornings blurred into late nights as I sketched models on whiteboards, coded prototypes, and refined algorithms that could shave millions off transportation costs for our clients. My crowning achievement, though, was a project codenamed Atlas, a dynamic predictive engine that combined machine learning with real-time geospatial data. It wasn't just a tool, it was an ecosystem, capable of anticipating bottlenecks and rerouting supply chains before disruptions even occurred. Atlas was my brainchild. I had nurtured it from concept to near completion, leading a team of brilliant developers who trusted me as much as I trusted them. Linvera's CEO, Richard Bellamy, had often called me his secret weapon. He was charismatic, sharp, and well-liked by investors. We weren't friends, but I believed we shared a mutual respect. He had publicly praised Atlas as the company's future. And yet, despite the accolades, I'd begun to notice cracks in the facade, an investor meeting I wasn't invited to, subtle changes to project documentation that bypassed me, and requests for progress reports that Richard insisted go directly to him rather than through proper channels. I chalked it up to corporate maneuvering, the kind that made me roll my eyes but not lose sleep. After all, Richard was a CEO. His job was to keep investors happy. But then there were stranger things. Questions from colleagues at competitor firms during industry conferences about features of Atlas I had never publicly disclosed, and a sense that others somehow knew more than they should about what my team was building. At first, I dismissed it as coincidence, yet a gnawing unease settled in my chest every time I walked into the office and saw Richard's easy smile. Still, I stayed focused. That's what I did best. Solve problems, build things, deliver results. If there was some bigger game happening around me, I figured it would reveal itself eventually. What I didn't realize then was that the betrayal had already begun, and that my so-called secret weapon had been quietly repurposed into someone else's bargaining chip. The first real blow came on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday morning. I was in my office reviewing a new data integration module for Atlas when my phone buzzed. An email from Richard, flagged urgent. The subject line read, Executive Review, Immediate. That alone was unusual. Richard rarely reached out directly unless it was big. I walked to his office expecting a discussion about funding or perhaps an accelerated launch plan. Instead, I found him seated across from our Chief Operations Officer, Helen Price, with a corporate lawyer I'd never met before. Ethan, Richard began, his tone unusually formal. We appreciate your contributions to Linvera, but effective immediately, your role here is being restructured. Restructured. The word hit me like a physical blow. I'm sorry, I managed. What are you talking about? Atlas is 6 weeks from full deployment. You can't restructure the lead on. This is a strategic decision, Helen cut in, her voice clinical. We've decided to reallocate project leadership to someone with a different skill set better aligned with our current trajectory. You'll transition to an advisory role. An advisory role? That was corporate speak for, you're being sidelined. I sat there, stunned. Are you telling me I'm being removed from the project I created? Richard gave me that same polished, almost pitying smile. It's not personal, Ethan. This is what's best for the company. But it was personal. I could feel it in my bones. I left that meeting with my head spinning. By the time I got back to my office, my system access had been downgraded. Atlas, my project, was gone from my dashboard. When I confronted IT, they mumbled something about, quote, executive directives. My emails to my team bounced back with automated messages that my, quote, project assignment had been updated. In less than an hour, I'd been effectively erased from my own creation. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the meeting, trying to rationalize their decision. But deep down, I knew there was more. This wasn't about skill sets or corporate strategy. This was about control. And it wasn't hard to guess why. Atlas wasn't just another software product. It had the potential to redefine entire industries. Whoever controlled it controlled the future of Linvera. A few days later, the full scope of the betrayal revealed itself. I was at a tech networking event downtown when a contact from a rival firm, Preston Clark at Nexora, casually mentioned, "Interesting work you've been doing with predictive rerouting using hybrid data streams. We're seeing similar approaches in our new models. Might even be a collaboration in the future." My blood ran cold. That feature, predictive rerouting using hybrid data streams, wasn't public. It was part of the unreleased core of Atlas. Nexora had no way of knowing about it, unless someone told them. In the days that followed, I began digging. I reached out to old colleagues, checked industry filings, and pieced together information from informal conversations. What I uncovered left me reeling. Linvera had been quietly licensing key components of Atlas's architecture to strategic partners, competitors in reality, under the guise of collaborative agreements. And Richard? He was the one signing off on those deals. They hadn't just stolen my work, they were selling it. I felt humiliated, violated. Every late night, every weekend I'd sacrificed, every ounce of creativity I'd poured into Atlas, they'd packaged it and handed it to rivals like a commodity. I had been so focused on building that I hadn't noticed my own company turning me into a pawn. For a while, I wallowed in anger. I thought about going public, about suing, about torching every bridge in sight. But I knew Richard. He played the long game. If I moved impulsively, I'd lose before I even started. It was Helen, of all people, who gave me my first glimmer of a way forward. A week after my demotion, she called me into her office. "Off the record," she said, lowering her voice. "I don't like how this was handled. But Richard has leverage. Those deals with Nexora and Titan Solutions are locked in with watertight contracts. You go to war over this, you'll be buried." I left her office angrier than ever, but also more determined. If Richard thought I was beaten, he'd underestimated me. I had built Atlas from nothing. I knew its architecture, its vulnerabilities, its potential. If they wanted to sell my ideas to competitors, fine. But I could turn that betrayal into my advantage. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about survival and taking back what was mine. When the first wave of anger subsided, what settled in was a sobering clarity. I couldn't outshout Richard Bellamy. He had the board, the lawyers, and a network of investors who believed in his polished smile. But he didn't have my brain. He didn't know Atlas the way I did. Not the intricacies of its machine learning models, not the layers of code that made it more than just a logistics tool, but a living system. That was my leverage, and if I could find a way to use it, I could turn what they'd stolen into my weapon. The first step was understanding the battlefield. I spent hours in my apartment, blinds drawn, poring over every piece of information I could scrape together about Linvera's, quote, partnerships. Through quiet calls with former colleagues and favors owed by contacts in the industry, I confirmed my suspicions. Linvera had entered into, quote, data-sharing agreements with Nexora, Titan Solutions, and a third firm, Parallax Dynamics. These weren't collaborations. They were fire sales. Richard had offloaded components of Atlas in exchange for rapid cash injections, all dressed up as joint ventures to appease the board. But here's what Richard didn't account for. Those deals had limitations. Linvera didn't just hand over Atlas wholesale. They licensed components, fragments of an engine that only I fully understood. Without me, without my intimate knowledge of how those components fit into the broader system, those companies would hit walls eventually. And when they did, they'd need someone who could solve those problems. That someone could be me. The idea came to me late one night while I was sketching Atlas's system architecture on my kitchen table, coffee gone cold beside me. What if, instead of going to war with these so-called competitors, I approached them directly? Not as Ethan Marshall, the wronged employee, but as the architect of the very technology they'd been sold. What if I positioned myself as their missing key? I started by mapping out what each company had likely acquired. Nexora, from what Preston let slip, had the predictive rerouting module. Titan, based on their recent press releases, had licensing rights to Atlas's real-time geospatial interface. Parallax had been eerily quiet, probably because they were sitting on the adaptive optimization framework, a piece so complex that even my best engineers needed weeks to tune it. I built dossiers for each, their probable pain points, their upcoming product deadlines, their competitive weaknesses. Then I assessed my own position. I had no corporate backing, no legal authority over Atlas, but I had something better: insider knowledge and credibility. In this industry, reputations weren't built by titles. They were built by results, and I had delivered results for years. If I approached these companies carefully, offering consultation, not sabotage, they'd listen. But it couldn't just be about getting work. That would be short-sighted. I needed leverage, the kind that would make Linvera irrelevant in this equation. That meant two things: building my own platform and creating alliances that Richard couldn't touch. So I quietly incorporated a consultancy, Astra Analytics. On paper, it was a small firm specializing in advanced supply chain AI. In reality, it was my beachhead. I reached out to two former colleagues I trusted implicitly: Nadia, a data scientist whose brilliance was matched only by her loyalty, and Luis, a systems engineer who had been with me on Atlas from day one. They didn't hesitate. Within weeks, we were meeting in my apartment after hours, using our own laptops to refine the frameworks that Linvera thought they owned. My pitch to the competitors had to be flawless. I crafted it like a chess move, careful, deliberate, leaving no room for misinterpretation. I wasn't there to accuse or expose. I was there to help them unlock the full potential of the, quote, technology they had been sold. If I came across as hostile or desperate, they'd shut me out. But if I came across as a calm, confident expert offering value, they'd see me as indispensable. Before reaching out, I needed one more piece of leverage. I spent hours reviewing the code snippets and architectural diagrams I'd saved over the years. That's when I found it. An intentional gap I had left in the earliest design documents of Atlas. It was a placeholder algorithm I always intended to refine later. It wasn't an error, but it would cause significant inefficiencies if implemented as is. Linvera's licenses had almost certainly included this version, meaning every competitor working with those modules would eventually hit the same roadblock. A roadblock only I knew how to bypass. That was my ace. It wasn't enough to be angry anymore. Anger made you reckless. What I needed was precision, so I planned, step by step, how I'd approach each company, how I'd build trust without revealing too much, how I'd position Astra Analytics as the quiet powerhouse behind their future products. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was building something bigger than Atlas. And for the first time since that humiliating meeting in Richard's office, I felt calm. This wasn't just about reclaiming what they took from me. This was about turning the tables completely. I started with Nexora. They were the easiest entry point, aggressive in their expansion, notorious for swallowing up talent when they needed it. I called Preston Clark, my contact from the networking event, on a Thursday morning. I didn't pitch Astra Analytics right away. Instead, I asked how their predictive rerouting module was performing. He hesitated, then admitted they were experiencing integration friction. That was my opening. I can help with that, I said, keeping my tone even. Not as a Linvera employee, as a consultant. Off the record for now. Preston bit. He knew my reputation, and more importantly, he knew I was the one who had built the module they'd been struggling to implement. Within days, I was in Nexora's glass-walled conference room in San Francisco, walking them through the architecture like I still owned it. Technically, I didn't. But practically, no one alive knew that code better than I did. I didn't just solve their problem. I anticipated their next three. I gave them efficiency gains they hadn't even known were possible. Left them with a roadmap that made their executives visibly relax. And when they asked how I'd like to proceed, I gave them my carefully rehearsed line. Astra Analytics doesn't do one-off fixes. We build partnerships. If you want long-term support, we'll need a retainer agreement, they agreed. Titan Solutions was next. They were slower to trust. Understandably, since their CEO, Ellen Groves, had personally signed the licensing deal with Linvera, I approached them differently. I didn't lead with technical expertise. I led with business value. I showed them a projection of how their geospatial interface would underperform within 6 months if they kept operating with Linvera's incomplete code. Then I presented an optimization framework that, in reality, was a refined version of my original Atlas blueprint. They didn't sign right away. They tested me, requested proof-of-concept demos, sent their own engineers to challenge my methods. But when my models outperformed theirs by 18% in a controlled pilot, they didn't just agree to bring me on. Ellen herself called me to say, "I don't know how you're doing this, Mr. Marshall, but I'm glad you are." Parallax Dynamics was the toughest. They were secretive, paranoid even, likely aware they'd been sold a fragment of something they couldn't fully control. So I didn't go to them. I made them come to me. I posted an innocuous research paper on Astra's website, a white paper, outlining a solution to a well-known optimization problem that just happened to align perfectly with the headaches they were facing. 3 weeks later, they reached out. And just like that, I had all 3. By the end of the quarter, Astra Analytics had formal consulting agreements with Nexura, Titan, and Parallax. But these weren't just contracts. They were my insurance policy. Every hour I spent with them deepened their dependence on me, not Linvera. And I didn't just fix their issues. I helped them innovate, pushing each company further than Linvera ever could, because Richard Bellamy didn't understand the soul of Atlas. In parallel, I built Astra's brand. Nadia spearheaded our research arm, publishing technical insights under our name. Luis developed a demo platform that showcased the next generation of supply chain AI, a spiritual successor to Atlas that was ours alone. Within months, Astra wasn't just a consultancy. It was a name that people in the industry whispered with curiosity and respect. Richard must have caught wind of it. One afternoon, my phone lit up with an unlisted number. I knew who it was before I answered. "Ethan," Richard said, his voice smooth but tight. "We need to talk." "I'm listening. You're consulting for our partners. That's unorthodox." "Unorthodox," I repeated, letting the word hang. "You mean unethical? Like selling proprietary tech behind closed doors?" He didn't take the bait. "You've made your point, but let's be reasonable. Come back to Linvera. We can make this work." It was almost laughable. After everything, he thought I'd crawl back. "You sold me out, Richard," I said, my voice low. "You used my work like currency. I don't come back from that. Then you're making an enemy you don't need." "No," I said. "I'm making allies you can't afford to lose." And that was the truth. Nexura, Titan, and Parallax were no longer Linvera's partners. They were mine. When I hung up, I didn't feel fear. I felt something I hadn't in months. Power. This wasn't revenge anymore. This was a coup. By the time spring arrived, Astra Analytics wasn't just a quiet consultancy. It was a rising force. We had transformed from a handful of people working in my apartment into a fully functioning firm with a modest but sleek office downtown. But more importantly, we had something Linvera could never reclaim: trust. Nexura, Titan, and Parallax had stopped thinking of themselves as Linvera's partners. They now saw themselves as my allies. I'd positioned Astra not only as their problem solver, but as their competitive edge. They weren't just hiring a consultant. They were gaining an insider who knew the limitations of Linvera's so-called proprietary technology and how to surpass it. That's when the real opportunity came. It started with a dinner meeting with Preston from Nexura. He leaned across the table in a quiet corner of an upscale San Francisco restaurant and said, "Linvera's been bleeding us dry. Every quarter, they're raising license fees on modules we can't even optimize without you. I'm done with them. Tell me, Ethan, if you had full control over Atlas, what could you build for us?" Full control. That was the turning point. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked him a question of my own. What if you didn't need Linvera at all? The idea was simple yet seismic. If my 3 clients pooled resources, they could form a strategic alliance, not just to cut Linvera out, but to create something better. A new platform, cleaner, smarter, unburdened by Richard's compromises. I had the technical blueprint. They had the funding and infrastructure. The conversations that followed were some of the most delicate of my life. Over weeks of quiet negotiations, I laid out the vision for what I called Atlas X, a next-generation platform that would integrate the modules they already licensed, but expand them into a fully unified proprietary system. In short, it would replace Atlas. There was hesitation at first. These were competitors, after all, companies that weren't used to sharing. But I framed it differently. This isn't collaboration, it's survival. If they stayed dependent on Linvera, Richard would keep milking them. But if they built something together, they'd control their own futures and own a product that would crush Linvera's market dominance. It worked. Within 2 months, the alliance was formalized. Nexora, Titan, and Parallax each committed capital and resources to build Atlas X under Astra Analytics' leadership. I retained creative control, ensuring no one could repeat Richard's betrayal. When word reached Linvera, Richard's response was predictable. He tried to intimidate me, cease and desist letters claiming IP infringement, veiled threats about, quote, career suicide. But the truth was, he didn't have a case. Linvera had licensed fragments of Atlas to these companies. What they chose to do with their licensed technology and who they hired to help was none of his business. And now his, quote, partners were his competitors. The breaking point came at the annual Supply Chain Innovation Summit in New York. Linvera was scheduled to unveil Atlas as their flagship product, their big play to attract new investors. Richard, ever the showman, took the stage in front of a packed ballroom. But halfway through his presentation, he was interrupted by a press release from Nexora, Titan, and Parallax, jointly announcing their partnership with Astra Analytics and the upcoming launch of Atlas X. I wasn't in the ballroom, but I heard from several people who were that the tension was palpable. Investors immediately started leaving Linvera's booth to swarm ours. The headlines that week said it all. Linvera loses key partnerships to emerging competitor Astra Analytics. Atlas X poised to disrupt predictive logistics market. By the end of the quarter, Linvera's stock had plummeted. Their board forced Richard to resign. Me? I was in a very different position. I wasn't just the guy who built Atlas. I was now the architect of Atlas X, the centerpiece of an industry-shaking alliance. My name was being mentioned in rooms I'd once only dreamed of entering, not as an employee, but as a peer. The night I signed the final joint venture documents with my 3 new partners, I walked out of the conference room and stood alone in the hallway, just breathing, not celebrating, not gloating, just breathing. I had reclaimed my work, my dignity, my future, and I hadn't done it by burning everything down. I'd done it by building something stronger than the thing they tried to take from me. When I look back now, the strangest part isn't Richard's betrayal. It isn't the sleepless nights, the frantic strategy sessions, or the cautious handshakes in quiet conference rooms. It's how quickly the roles reversed. 2 years ago, I was a loyal employee who believed hard work was enough, that if I kept my head down and built something extraordinary, the people above me would honor that. I was wrong. Linvera taught me a brutal but invaluable truth. In business, ideas are currency, and if you're not protecting your own, someone else will spend them for you. But here's the thing Richard never understood. Ideas don't live on paper or in contracts. They live in the people who create them. He could sell fragments of Atlas to anyone he wanted, but without me, without the mind that built it, those fragments were just pieces. He underestimated that. He underestimated me. I didn't win by yelling louder or throwing stones. I won by turning their betrayal into my leverage. By transforming 3 of Linvera's partners into my allies, I took away Richard's power piece by piece until he had nothing left to stand on. And I didn't just take back what was mine. I built something better. Atlas X isn't just a product. It's a statement. It says that the people who create are more powerful than the people who exploit. When news broke that Richard had resigned, I felt no urge to celebrate his downfall. This was never about revenge, not really. It was about dignity, about taking back control of my own work, my own future. I've been asked many times what the moral of this story is, by journalists, by young entrepreneurs, even by the people I mentor now. The answer is simple. Never let someone else define your value. Corporations will call you an asset, a resource, a secret weapon, but when the time comes, they'll trade you like a commodity if it suits them. Protect your ideas. Own your narrative. I also learned that strength doesn't come from rage. It comes from restraint. I could have gone public with accusations. I could have tried to burn Linvera to the ground. But that would have left me holding ashes. Instead, I built. And in building, I created a future where I no longer had to fight for a seat at someone else's table, because I had built my own. Sometimes, when I'm in the Astra office late at night, looking out over the city skyline, I think back to the version of myself who sat in Richard's office that day, blindsided, humiliated, erased. I wish I could tell him, "Don't break, don't beg, you're stronger than this, and you're going to prove it, not by destroying them, but by outgrowing them." That's the lesson I carry forward. Betrayal can take a lot from you, but it can also give you something if you let it. Clarity. And with clarity, you can turn even the worst loss into your greatest advantage. Atlas was the best thing I ever built until I lost it. Atlas X is the best thing I ever built because I made it mine. And this time, no one's taking it away.